everybody. I'm just sitting on Zoom waiting for my friend Adele Jarret Kerr to join me from the UK. Adele is a homeschooling mum who I've known of for quite a few years through sort of attachment parenting blogging world. And she has also been on a journey of kind of rewilding, getting back to the land. And if you don't know of her work already, I think you're gonna love her. Today we're going to talk about her shift into unschooling from homeschooling and what was the motivation behind that. And we're going to weave around to talk about the invitations for homeschoolers in anti-racism work and what that looks like in our homes. Welcome, Adele. It's so nice to see your face and to be chatting when we've been in the same sort of orbit for so many years.
Mm-hmm.
Really good.
Thank you so much for having me, Lucy. It's really, I've been really looking forward to this.
Yay, cool. Well, I'm pretty keen to jump straight in. I have a few questions. And the first one is, I just love to hear from you a little bit about your recent shift from homeschooling into unschooling and what were the events that kind of led to that for you?
Yeah, so that has been happening for a really long time. I think it's kind of, putting it that way might give people the idea that one day we were super structured and then there was this lightning bolt event and then the next day we weren't. Whereas actually we had pretty much just been free flow for years. I just wasn't embracing it. And I was kind of telling myself, but we're still doing this, and when I was talking to people, maybe sometimes making myself sound more kind of structured than I actually was, because I was describing what I felt I should be doing rather than what was actually happening in my home. We have been on a path for a very long time. I'd say that, well, for the whole of my kids' lives, in trying to parent them respectfully, respect their autonomy, give them the space to do things and to make decisions and so on. But I hadn't completely got to the point where I brought education into that space. And because their temperaments are probably such that they're willing to go along with some stuff, I maybe didn't always notice the signs that they weren't totally there with what we were doing. And I have been listening for months to people talking about unschooling in terms of decolonisation, especially a Killers podcast that's been really, really great. And I've been thinking about that so much in terms of my identity as a woman from Trinidad, as an African descended woman. And I'm mixed with African, Indian and Chinese, and kind of all of those things have kind of not been identities that I've been really able to explore because of growing up in a European education context. Because although I grew up in Trinidad, our education is very much European. But I didn't really start to think about any of that stuff in great depth. I sort of expected that I just had to sort of live with that, go along with the system as is, until recently, when somebody actually calls out classical education as white supremacist, and suddenly everything just fell into place for me. Yeah. And I just thought, well, why are we doing this? Like, why do I feel like we have to carry on with this? Like, we're not even in the school system, so we can just lose all of those things that don't work for us, all those things that don't serve us as a mixed race family. Yeah. And so I just decided, actually, we have pretty much been unschooling anyway. Why don't we just finally claim this and actually say that the safest thing for our children is to follow them and to listen to what they want to do. And so I started looking at what we're doing, and I had called what we were doing consent-based, because pretty much they wouldn't say no. Like, they'd just say, yeah, okay. But that didn't mean that they were like, actually, yeah, I really want to sit down and do this thing with you. Yeah. It wasn't, yes, they would sit down and maybe do this history activity or whatever it was, but it wasn't setting them on fire. It wasn't like, it didn't come from them. It was coming from me. And I was also pulling it from a model that didn't fully respect people like us. You know, it's pulling it from a model that said that these are the things that are important according to a Eurocentric lens.
Yeah.
And I just wasn't prepared to do that anymore.
Yeah. Wow, that's such a cool story, and I love how you see it as basically an extension of just what you have been doing since birth, basically respecting them, being about their autonomy and a consensual relationship, and finally you were able to kind of like click in just the very last bit of really claiming and naming the thing that you were doing now, kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm interested to hear for you what you would say the differences between colonized education and decolonized learning, what the key differences are between those two things.
Yeah, I think I have an interesting perspective on that because I come from a country where colonization is a lot more obvious because I actually come from the Caribbean. I come from Trinidad and Tobago. And it's obvious in the sense that the colonizer is no longer really present because it is actually white people are actually the ethnic minority where I come from. But they are present in the sense that we're still using their education system, just with a few little tweaked bits. So maybe a bit more Caribbean, well, all the history is Caribbean history, Caribbean books, things have been renamed, but the actual system is based on a very old model of the British system. Yeah. And actually here, when people were quite upset about the changes that were being made to make the system more rigorous, which was really about take it back to Edwardian days or whatever, I was looking at all the changes and thinking, oh, that's what I grew up with.
Yeah.
You know, that's what school looked like when I was growing up. And so I think that was a little thing that I sort of had in my head as well. Why did it look like that? Yeah. As recently as that, and what is the impact of taking it back there now? But what it meant for me is that I kind of I grew up sort of seeing European ideals as the ideal. So what literature was considered the important literature, what history was considered the important history, even though I was learning about colonialism and slavery, which people don't really learn about here, I wasn't learning further back than that. So, you know, still wasn't learning about the histories of my people before they were transported. And that's something that I think that's a really key part of colonized education, is that the starting point is itself Eurocentric for a lot of these things. Even looking at scientific discoveries, a lot of European scientific discoveries were actually building on things or co-opting things that came from the Arab world, or you know, or parts of Africa. You know, so there are a lot of things that we don't learn about. So that's one thing, is that the history doesn't go far back enough. So when people are learning about sort of Black history or whatever history they're learning about, they spend a month learning about pain, and they don't learn about the history of all peoples as equal. Then also just the sense that there is a set of books, or a set of ideas, or a set of skills even, that need to be learned for you to live a fruitful and successful life. Even the idea of what a successful life is, like all of that, there is just a one way of it, which is a signifier of colonization. There's no appreciation for ancestral ways of learning. There's no appreciation for diversity in any respect. You know, even diversity in terms of the ways that people find happiness. You know, there's everything is supposed to be brought into one line, and the idea of standardized testing, or the skills that you're supposed to learn at the age of 5, all of that doesn't really take into account that there is difference, and it is all colonization. It is something that came in with colonization. The education was brought to bring the masses into a certain line to fulfill a certain purpose. You see this very clearly with the effects that it had on Indigenous people. You know, it kind of came in and said that actually your ways of learning are not really acceptable ways of learning. Come and actually learn. Forget any instinctual ways, forget any ancestral ways, forget any spiritual ways, and come and learn these intellectual ways. And we don't consider your intellectual ways. You know, it's just a lot of erasure has occurred. And it affects everybody. It affects white people, it affects white passing people, it affects people of all colors, it affects Black people and non-Black people of color.
Yeah. It's totally true, like that that decolonization work is for all of us. Like we have all been held to these really arbitrary and rigid sets of information, knowledge, and ways of measuring those things that are literally made up.
Yeah.
Like people you know, sometimes might say, oh well, but what about the education gaps if you choose unschooling instead of school? And it's like, oh well, there will be education gaps. Like, to me, education gaps is just like community knowledge. It's the idea that all of us hold different pieces of information and together we form a whole. But if you're unschooling, you'll have some education gaps, and if you're within a school system, you'll definitely have education gaps, but those ones would have been chosen by quite a homogenous and elite group of people. They're not better education gaps. In fact, I would say that they're the kind of education gaps that pretty much uphold white supremacy culture and those the capitalistic system that we're all living in. It's
well, the school system itself is kind of a disruptor of community, you know, that community knowledge, even just by the fact that we segregate children by age and we segregate them from the rest of society. So you're already learning a message from very early on that that you're not supposed to be that you don't learn by being around others and doing things with them, that there is only one way of learning, and it's a very individualistic way because you're put into the system to perform, and it's about your individual performance. So by the time you come out of it, you kind of have lost a lot of the skills that you could have been developing all that time in terms of communicating and finding other ways of sourcing information from people, and learning through conversation, learning through working alongside people, observing. We almost have to relearn how to learn.
You have to, totally have to relearn how to learn, and you definitely, oh my goodness, have to decondition around how to be and how to be with other people, because for so many years we learn only a certain way of like relating to people, and usually it's based around comparison and being compared to them.
And fear as well, because you're learning to relate to all the adults that you're surrounded by for all of these hours of the week in a fear-based dynamic.
Thank you so much. It's such a fizzing topic for me. I could just be like, I can feel myself like getting into like this bubble of excitement talking about it. I'm gonna try and pull us back. Okay, I wonder about this, just in terms of that kind of being and that relearning how to learn, and like relearning how to just be a human and not be like, I don't know, rushing around competing or living up to expectations or whatever. You know, during pandemic, these months of pandemic and quarantine, it has felt like there has been somewhat of a collective kind of pause on things. I mean, obviously there's been an external pause, but it feels like there has been a bit of an inner pause for people as well, and that we have been kind of had given this chance, this opportunity to just let stuff go and just learn how it feels to stop rushing around and to actually stop
Mm.
and be with ourselves and be with our people. Um, how did sort of quarantine, what effect have the last few months had on your ability to kind of claim, your learning as the work of decolonisation and now naming it as unschooling? Did that have an influence?
Yeah, I realized that being around other people a lot, I think in the context of being in a country that I still don't feel completely comfortable in, um, it sort of means that I'm kind of almost always feeling like I'm switched on, like I'm having to perform, like I'm having to be in the world in a certain way. And so in a way, it has been helpful to take some time away and kind of figure out, but how do I actually want to be in the world? And what is actually serving us? And actually, it's been a chance to kind of get to know my kids a bit better and to slow down and to just chat with them and to just listen to them. And because they've been pretty much my only social contact
Yeah.
for a lot of the time, because Lawrence has had to be on the farm a lot, and in the earlier part of lockdown we weren't able to be. It has meant that I've been able to go a lot more with them and learn how their brains work a little bit, and realize that actually they're sending me a lot of messages that aren't necessarily verbal, and if I'm not too busy I can actually hear them, can actually pick up on what those messages are. And I think collectively, because people are not working as much or in the same way, or that they're a lot of their social contact has been slowed down, so that they are online a bit more, maybe picking up messages that they aren't picking up normally. It has given the space for people to be thinking about things that they haven't been thinking about, particularly to do with Black Lives Matter. And I just don't think that it would have got the kind of I don't think that it would have picked up the way that it has in terms of white voices getting involved if it hadn't been for the pandemic. Afua Hirsch, who's she's a racism educator, she was talking about an experience that she had had on the BBC a few years ago, which I had seen actually, where she was talking to somebody about the fact that we need to start talking about the statues, and that she wasn't talking about removing statues, but she was saying that we need to discuss them and reconsider what we're going to do with them. And then the white presenter who she was speaking with basically said to her, well, if you don't like it, why don't you just go, why do you stay here? If you don't like what we do here in Britain. And she was quite hurt and said, but very, very self-contained, but you've probably seen this. And she said, well, I find it strange that you say that, because where would I go? Britain is my home. And she recently said that at the time she didn't really get anybody kind of really responding to that when it went out.
Yeah.
And I know why people like me wouldn't have been doing a shout out about it, because we've heard it.
Yeah.
It's what we hear. I can't think that there's any person of color who hasn't criticized the government in some way to not be told that at some point, go back to where you've come from. And for me, well, I literally am not from here, but my destiny is tied to this country because of colonization. And I live here. And if I were white and from anywhere, nobody would say that, basically. But the point of bringing up that story is that she shared it again recently, and it had the support of millions.
Yeah.
And it's just another indicator that things are shifting. There is something that has come up in the collective consciousness. That doesn't mean that racism is suddenly going to be over. And it doesn't mean that we're going to see all the walls suddenly crash. But there is an opportunity to do something here, as we rebuild society. And certainly around schools, there's an opportunity to do something with the education system, because not everybody is going to home educate. But if the school system changed, it would enable a lot of people to feel that they could home educate the way that they wanted to. They could feel freer not to have to follow a certain system, because the system would have become freer, and not be measuring themselves over time. And certainly people of color often feel like they have to measure up, because we're judged so much more harshly, basically.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It did feel as if that the kind of whole COVID experience, and then like that invitation to, if we're going to get back into life, we need to make sure we're only bringing with us what we want to be with us. And it's like looking around at those statues and being like, well, for starters, they've got to go, God's sake. And with education as well, like I think loads of people have gone, well, actually my kids are doing so much better since not going to school every single day. I thought I had like quite an anxious, quite controlling kid that didn't really play anymore, and instead over the last few months, like this is stories that I get email like over the last couple of months. My 10-year-old has started to play again. They've become so much more relaxed. They've started to laugh really freely, and so I think people are just like washing their hands of like, nope, okay, formal education, that's not something I'm going to take into the future with me either. Racism, nope, okay, that can go. It does feel like quite obviously like well overdue, but quite a really remarkable time.
But it's a long process as well. Like, it's really easy to say, right, I'm not going to take racism into the future with me, but it's a lifelong process working out all of the ways. I mean, for me, it's really hard working out it's an ongoing process working out all the ways that I need to dismantle internalized racism that I have. And I just can't wrap my head around the idea that I have to do so much work to dismantle internalized racism, but a white person can just decide that they're not racist. I don't think that that's possible.
Yeah, totally.
And also with deciding going to leave formal schooling behind, deschooling is such a long that's an ongoing process. That's learning to live with things that are uncomfortable, because of the way that we were raised. Even if our kids have never been in school, even if we ourselves were home educated, we're more likely to be home educated in a way that still referenced the school system. And we're still living in a society where that is the dominant, that is the norm, that is the way that children are are educated. And so we need to be actively pushing against that and looking at where we're kind of accidentally getting into those places. I mean, I feel like that with any sort of like I have to pause a lot in my parenting and think, right, that sounded gentle, but was there a bit of covert manipulation going on there? And I think it's a similar thing with all of these things, that they're just so much a part of our lives that we need to just keep accepting, that we going to have to keep reflecting and looking at what we're doing, and are there areas that we're ignoring that need some attention. I think the pandemic has shone a light here for a lot of people in Britain in terms of what's happening with how with how people of color are treated here. Black people and people of color, because of how people have been treated during the pandemic, and how people have not been protected when they've been on the front lines as well. And Black people and people of color are more likely to be in frontline jobs. So they have been, people have been stopped a lot more, and have faced a lot more police brutality for things that white people have been allowed to just get on with. People are being asked for identification. Who carries identification here in the UK? It's just not, it's not the way that it's done here. I think those things have kind of made it a bit more obvious for some people that it's not just an American problem, and it is something that needs to be addressed here. Unfortunately, it's not really got through to everybody. So though we're seeing a lot of stuff online, there is a lot of stuff in real life where people still aren't really interacting with this, which is why people have to kind of see this as a long game that we're
Yeah.
playing.
Yeah. And I think on my recent video, I just spoke about the conversations that we do purposefully, intentionally sit down to have with our children, even though
Yeah.
we try and, mostly allow them to develop their own thoughts, and how racism and white privilege is one of those things. And I had a few comments of people just sort of saying, we just wait for it to arise and then we talk about it. And but I really do think that basically, if you've got enough privileges, it won't really arise for your family. So that's not actually going to really work. And I think a lot of people don't know that the research says that if you don't actively have conversations with your children about racism, they don't pick up through osmosis your general love of all humankind. They actually pick up the racist dominant thinking of the culture. So
Yeah.
those are actually conversations that you really have to be having, like, super intentionally with your kids. And I think, yeah, I don't know, like, so your part of your decolonization work is coming out through education, but you did also mention that you're also committing to doing like that inner anti-racism work. And for me as a white woman, I have so much of that work to constantly commit to and to show up for. With regards to homeschooling and home life, it looks like having those conversations and looking for opportunities to literally point it out and pause the movie
Mm-hmm.
and be like, did you notice that? And that kind of thing. It also looks like having really diverse representation on our bookshelf, and
Yeah.
for the media that we're consuming, and pointing different things out. For me as well, it looks like creating an equitable space for our unschooling community, and a place that is welcoming and inclusive, and that kind of thing. So those are like kind of obvious
Mm.
anti-racism things that the homeschooling family is invited to do. And I guess I'd love to hear from you about some of the less obvious things, the more wide, like far-reaching, sort of wider,
Mm.
slightly less tangible things that we're invited to do as part of our anti-racism homeschooling efforts.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I loved that video, and I loved what you said about the dominant culture, because it's one thing to say that I'm not going to project messages on my children, but they're still going to be getting messages from the dominant culture. And if they are messages that are really, really harmful, then it is responsible and respectful to offer something else quite early on. Also, I think people don't necessarily, I realize this isn't what you asked me, but I'm going to talk about this. I think people don't realize that their kids maybe have harmful interactions with other kids that you might not be present for. And that that child might go away and talk to their parents, and their parents might not feel able to address with you. I've had this a number of times where children have said things that have not been helpful for my children in terms of their self-esteem, around the color of their skin. And I have not been in a situation where I felt strong enough to go and talk to that other parent. And so I've poured all of my energy into building up my child, and saying, explaining why we look the way that we do, and all of the different colors that we come in, all of the different hair that we have, all of that stuff is amazing and is beautiful. And I've had to explain to them about like why not everybody thinks that way, why not everybody sees difference as beautiful. And I sort of feel like, but I shouldn't really have to, like, I shouldn't be, it's not really my problem here. That if their parents even had like were even showing them diverse books or diverse movies, or chatting about the things that you're chatting about, then we wouldn't be having this conversation. I wouldn't be having to build up my child about something that they shouldn't need to be built up about. It should just be a given that the way that you look is amazing.
Yeah.
You know, and it's just a part of things. Yeah, in terms of the bigger things, there are a lot of systemic things that people don't really think about. Fourth thing, a lot of people have been talking about not wanting to raise kids who are anti-racist, or not wanting to raise kids who are racist, or just saying to other people, guys, stop raising racist kids, as if like it's only some people who are doing this. But the work starts with doing some inner work, and that involves some self-compassion, that involves some education. So rather than just focusing on how you're going to educate your children, a lot of people need to spend some time educating themselves, and not just intellectually, but actually interacting with things on an emotional and mindful level, so that they can then have the energy to take on the bigger, more political things, and to be able to stop the movie and pull something out. I think there are lots of times where actually there are things that people probably don't spot, because they haven't spent that time thinking about it and living in this stuff first, and just take for granted that they know what something racist looks like, when actually they probably don't. And so they probably do need to spend a lot more time listening to people who are very generously sharing of their experience, and sharing of the work that they've done in this area. So I think it starts with working on ourselves first. So rather than just kind of bulldozing in and trying to fix everything overnight, it does start with pausing and looking at ourselves. And it can be really helpful, and this is something that's helpful for everybody, regardless of whether white or not, to look at all of your identities, in an intersectional way. And so looking at all of the areas where you have privilege, or you're a target group, or you are a border group, and thinking about where does that benefit me, where whose needs do I need to start thinking about, what could I be doing that would enable everybody to enjoy the rights that I enjoy. So I am a woman of color, so I fall into the target group of Black, Asian, and in this country, other ethnic minorities. But I am also a light-skinned woman, and I am also temporarily able-bodied. And so, and just, it's different things like that. So I need to be thinking about, okay, so how could I be gaining some agency for the needs of trans people, for the needs of somebody in a wheelchair, for somebody who is neurodivergent, and thinking about all of those things, and that will also be benefiting. If I was a white woman and doing that, that would also be benefiting a people of color, because they suffer under those things even more because of intersectionality. Being a child who has autism is different. Where if you're a Black child who has autism, being a person in a wheelchair is different if you're a Black person in a wheelchair. And so actually we are looking after everybody when we're thinking intersectionally. So I think that's another way to go with that. Certainly, when you raise things in the home ed community around race, there is always somebody who will say, well, we're suffering too, especially here in Cornwall, because a lot of people are living with a feeling of dispossession, with a feeling, and with an economic reality that they are struggling. Yeah. But it's very different to be in that situation and also living under systemic racism.
Yeah.
And in this country, it is a reality, as it is in the States and in a lot of other countries, that if you are a person of color, you are much, much more likely to be living in poverty. So if we tackle poverty, like it's not saying if we tackle poverty through the anti-racist lens, that would be really, really helping to improve the situation for people of color to be able to have freedom of choice with what they want to do. And it will also be improving the situation for everybody. Yeah. So it's not really a case of thinking that it's an either or. If their needs are met, then somehow my needs are not. If we are looking after the people in our society who are most vulnerable, then we're actually looking after everybody. And I think it's a bit of a misnomer when people start talking about like the white working class as if like somehow Black people are not part of the working class.
Yeah, totally.
You know, we are all natural allies if we choose to be, if we allow ourselves to fall into that, rather than feeling like there is a competition for these resources.
Yeah.
And allowing that to get in the way of us looking at where those resources are most lacking, where those resources are most needed right now, where is crying out for help the most. And I don't mean in terms of like crying out for somebody else to come and save them, you know, but where does power need to be shared?
Yeah, thank you. And that being like really practical, right? You know, that power sharing and that redistribution of resources is really practical thing. And I think once you recognize that and you look at your own life, you can go, oh, I have choices every single day where I could very practically shift power and redistribute stuff. But you don't, if you're in your insulated bubble and you haven't heard the call to step out of it and actually act, not just stick with the, oh, well, I read all the books. You know, every day it's like I get a choice to make my anti-racism work really practical here.
In terms of practical ways, because people do not think about things as like universal basic income as being part of their anti-racist work, but it absolutely is, because of the fact that people of color are more likely to be living in poverty. And if there was universal basic income, yes, it would benefit everybody. Thinking about it in an anti-racist way means that you're allowing those people to have access to the resources where they can make more choices about what they want to do. And certainly there's a conversation happening in the UK and the US around land ownership, and the fact that people of color are a lot less likely to have land access, even on a communal level. And so there's a lot happening where people are raising the funds to buy land communally so that they can start farming and or just creating spaces where they can have their own projects. And there's a lot of autonomy that can come out of that a lot of white people take for granted, because the land is accessible to them. And I think if we put that in the home education context, that funds are going to be popping up amongst Black and brown people to allow more people to have choices around having projects that reflect their culture and reflect what they want to do, and giving them a bit more autonomy and a bit more choices. And people can choose to be a part of that. People can choose to partner with what is already out there, actively look for organizations to be supporting. And there's no shortage of that. To even be just chatting with their friends about, like, is what we're doing reflecting what you want to do, you know, and just giving a bit more, because don't take it for granted that the project that you've set up is like naturally welcoming and reflective of all. If you sort of see your project as neutral, that's probably a good sign that it's not. Neutral is just another word for white, basically. So, or Eurocentric. You know, a lot of the time people even look at like look at the workshops or the courses that they're offering and just think that, well, there's nothing unusual about what I'm offering. And I think in well, in a system where we know that white supremacy is the dominant culture, is a part of the dominant culture, then if what you're offering isn't unusual, that is in itself is problematic. That's something that you need to pause and think about. Like, this is maybe going off on a bit of a tangent, but thinking
Love a
about
tangent.
unschooling. Yeah, thinking about unschooling as an act of decolonisation, as an anti-racist tool, we can take it for granted that, well, children aren't born racist, and therefore if we're following their lead, then what we're doing won't be racist, and therefore unschool, the end, nothing else that needs to really happen. But they're still going to be absorbing all of the things around them. You're still going to be absorbing all of the things around you. And there are little areas where you just need to be questioning, what am I putting in their path? What am I putting in my own path? Like earlier this week, there's this homeschool summit going on right now online. It's a global summit. I don't know if you've come across it. There is some self-directed stuff on it. But yeah, there was this guy who was talking about self-directed education. I'm not going to name him because what I'm saying is not very complimentary. But at the end, he was asked if you could bring anybody in right now to speak to us about home education, who would it be? And he said, oh, any of the colonial founding fathers. So, and I was just like, okay, so if you could bring in anybody from all of time, from all of the world to speak to us, right in this moment where this conversation, we're actively having this conversation, and that is what you would say. Okay, well, you've pretty much confirmed to me that I don't really want to listen to white dudes talk about home education anymore.
Oh my goodness, that's
Yeah.
unreal, isn't it?
But you know what was really funny was that then the interviewer, because they had somebody who was kind of like it was more of a conversation rather than just a straight talk. The interviewer very quickly came and said, oh, do you remember who you said last year? Last year you said Will Smith.
Oh, like trying to sort of cover up.
But it's
Like,
okay, it's okay. He's not really a racist because
yeah,
he's
yeah.
like, you
He
said, if
said
you
a
could talk to
black man last
anybody.
year, so he's
Yeah,
all
yeah. So
good,
it's okay
really.
that he said that, you know, people who were slaveholders and who actually created these systems and kept them in place, that they're who we should be listening to.
It
So, not
really
to mention, a lot of these people were not just holding slaves; they were also raping their slaves. And yet we look up to them as thought leaders.
Yeah. Oh my goodness, it really beggars belief. It's like, oh, super
But it says
gross.
something. It says something about what all of this, you know, what education is founded on. These people who we're looking up to, and we just excuse all of the other things that they've done as saying, well, it was the time. You know, and I really, really hate that as an argument, because yes, it was a time where a lot of white people thought like that. Do you really think that it was a time when Black people didn't think of themselves as people?
Yeah,
So
totally.
even looking at it that way is through a Eurocentric lens.
Yeah, absolutely. That's unreal. And and just is testament to how you kind of look up to and you tend to surround yourself with people who look like you. And and that's like such a great example of that. But we do that all of the time.
And
Really.
maybe it's also sometimes, you know, deciding, I know this is something that you've been thinking about, but it's sometimes deciding that actually, yes, I've been asked, but somebody else should be asked. Or if you are going to be, like, a lot of homeschoolers are going to be on panels, and maybe they should be pausing to ask, well, who else is on the panel? So, you know, there's a lot of conversation around this in terms of men realizing that they need to make sure that the panels that they're on aren't all male, but the conversation needs to extend to thinking about, is the panel all white as well?
Yeah. Which isn't just like, oh, a cool thing, a good thing to do or whatever. It's like actually really important, because white supremacy culture is not serving humankind in any way. It's not serving the earth. It's not allowing us to create the future that we need as a
Yeah.
species. And actually,
Mm-hmm.
I believe that, Black people of color, indigenous voices actually hold like wisdom and pieces of the puzzle that can like lead us out of this mess that we've created for ourselves. Like that's why you do it. It's not to just have a diverse panel. It's actually because we believe that the white voice has, through colonization in general, lost touch with what humankind actually needs to survive, to thrive, and to live in connection. That's kind of
and we're seeing that happen with a lot of people trying to reclaim cultures that they have that cultures of their ancestors that they have been separated from. It's been really interesting for me reading about a lot of the agricultural and spiritual practices that come from African people around the world that I grew up hearing about, kind of like sort of spoken about in kind of a derogatory way. And I'm not even talking about by white people. I'm talking about by black people and people of color. That we have become so separate from these ancestral ways that that should be ours and things that we can claim so much power from, but we're almost we're taught that there is a more evolved way, I guess, and that those ways aren't important anymore. I think I need to actually pull an example, otherwise I'm not really making any sense. But like it used to be a sort of it was a sort of a joke growing up, laughing about like the bush bath. Like if you have a problem, go buy an Obia woman and have a bush bath, and that was kind of used in a derogatory, joking kind of way. Whereas I'm reading about a lot about that stuff now and recognizing that for a lot of people, this is a deeply spiritual, powerful thing that that connects you to nature, and how the herbs are chosen, the incantations that are chosen, and all of this stuff was stuff that was just never really looked at in any sort of serious way when I was growing up. Whereas all of this stuff is a part of our history that we probably need to at least take a closer look at in the Caribbean. And a lot of people are starting to reclaim those things and to say, actually, it's not just folk wisdom. Folk wisdom is wisdom too.
But it's been such a pleasure talking with you and just hearing from you. And I'll link to your couple of blogs and your amazing Revillaging podcast, which is so great. Time for another episode.
Yeah, I kind of lost track of that under lockdown, but then that's kind of, life happens and we need to normalize that as well.
Totally. Like on my podcast yesterday, she was chatting about just the non-linear nature of anything really. She was specifically talking about community building, but it's just everything. And it was really cool for me because my podcast goes in fits and starts, and I'm like, it's just a non-linear podcast, that baby. So I'll link to all of your stuff below so people can come over and read even more of your well thought out stuff around all of this. Thank you so much, and goodbye, and go well and have an awesome day.